Who is a person that everyone thought was crazy, but they ended up being right? Sinead O'Connor. Okay, so she was a little crazy, but she was also right. In October 1992, O'Connor performed an a cappella rendition of Bob Marley's War on Saturday Night Live. The song, she ripped up a photo of Pope John Paul II in protest of the Catholic Church's rampant sexual abuse of children almost a decade before the rest of the world knew or cared about the offenses. She was banned from SNL and was largely blacklisted from the entertainment industry as a whole afterward. Source: Harry Markopolos figured out that Madoff was a crook long before anyone else did. Malcolm Gladwell did a podcast about society's ability to function if no one trusted anyone. TL Drive: we need some cynics in the world like this guy. That even basic functions of our life and culture, like driving, would be impossible if most of us felt like we had to verify everything. Barry James Marshall was one of the scientists who discovered that the bacteria H. pylori causes stomach ulcers. However, getting people to believe it was difficult. It was thought that lifestyle and excessive stomach acid were the main factor that led to ulcers. And he suggested that a bacterial infection could cause it. No one believed him. In response, he infected himself with H. pylori by drinking cultures, which in turn gave himself stomach ulcers, and then treated the infection. He and Robin Warren received a Nobel Prize for this discovery. Barbara Lee, U.S. Congress to vote against the post-9/11 authorization for use of military force because it was too broad and did not have a clear objective or duration, warning that it could lead to an endless war. For this, she was harassed and threatened for her position and safety. Turns out the AUMF resolution was indeed a blank check for the Pentagon to use military force on whoever they wanted for the foreseeable future. Christine Collins, famously portrayed by Angelina Jolie in the movie Changeling. After her son was abducted, the police found him months later and reunited them. But Christine was adamant that it wasn't her son Walter and was an imposter. He had evidence to prove it. She was temporarily committed by the officer in charge of the case, and even after the kid admitted he lied and wasn't Walter, it still took over a week to release Christine. My grandma, she insisted people kept stealing her newspaper, and specifically said it was someone in a white van. Grandma was always a little off, so we just thought she was paranoid and had a bad delivery person. Until one day my mum and I are driving past her house and a white van in front of us stopped, stole my grandma's newspaper, and drove off. Grandma wasn't crazy after, or at least not about that. Barry Marshall, remember in the 80s, when everyone seemed to have ulcers, and they were basically treated with Tums. Marshall was a researcher who discovered that H. pylori bacteria caused ulcers, not just too much acid in the stomach. Unfortunately, no one would believe him, so he literally documented himself drinking the bacteria, getting ulcers, and successfully treating them with antibiotics. Sinead O'Connor. Catholic Church were fucking creeps. Treated women and children appallingly. To this day in some areas you have to get marriage lessons from a priest who is celibate and teaches about family and marital issues among other shit. That's like a postman telling a farmer how to grow his potatoes. I know nothing about it, but I'll tell you anyway. Bernie Sanders was the only person in the Senate who voted against going to war in Iraq. We all thought we were riding to war to end a terrible regime, and to a certain extent we were. But we were lied to about almost everything else, and Bernie was one of the few to see it. People mocked him for it for years. But more than 20 years later, history has vindicated him. Goddard. Orc Times ridiculed thee in the 1920s. The press, bolstered by some scientists, decided that a rocket in space was completely impossible because there was nothing in space for a rocket to push against. Goddard was ridiculed as an insane crackpot, but he was actually completely right. Ludwig Boltzmann. ND formulas explained the physical properties of matter, but as it went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of an atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. Galileo Galilei. For those who don't know him, He was a scientist who lived 1564–1642. He proved that the solar system turns around the sun and not round the earth. At first the people thought he was crazy. He even got locked up by the Catholic Church. But as we know today, he was right and the father of the solar system. We know today. Some of the elderly patients with dementia in a home in my city kept complaining they weren't given food. Everyone thought they must have forgotten that they'd already eaten, as people with dementia sometimes do. Nope. Turns out some pieces of shit nursing staff didn't always give everyone their meals, amongst other abuse. Psychiatric hospital after being accused of fabricating a story of money laundering activities at a major bank is to have his case reviewed after evidence has emerged proving the validity of his claims. Drive Katie Carrico, who worked on the mRNA vaccine that became the basis of the COVID vaccine. She struggled to stay afloat in academia, but kept working on mRNA and then ended up with the Nobel Prize. Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys. One of the main themes in his lyrics is that the American right is planning a fascist takeover of America, not too dissimilar from what happened to Germany. This goes back to 1980. Most saw him as a kook or an alarmist, but it is now clear that he was absolutely correct. Midwives had been washing their hands for years when delivering babies, but no one accepted that as standard practice because they were women, and what do they know? And even though hand washing was common with midwives, it's still attributed to a male doctor from the 1800s as the origin of the idea. Philippa Langley, she believed Richard III was buried under a car park in Leicester, and was found to be correct, and he was. Org Wiki Exhumation and Reburial of Richard III of England. Kerry Webb, the San Jose Mercury news reporter that uncovered the CIA link to crack cocaine into Los Angeles. The government used other newspapers to discredit him. A few years later, he was found in his home with 2 bullet holes in his head, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. He was right. The lady who got burned from McDonald's coffee. If I recall, she was so injured she lost 20 of her body weight while hospitalized. McDonald's was later discovered to be intentionally selling nuclear hot coffee because you couldn't drink it quickly and thus ordered fewer refills. Ignaz Semmelweis, he theorized that the reason infant mortality was so high is because there are tiny creatures on our hands. He would say that by simply washing your hands before delivering a baby will lower the chance of the infant's death. He died in a mental institution. I don't remember his name, but a man on one of the planes that crashed into the Twin Towers called police and told them that there were suspicious people on his plane. They didn't take him seriously. The people he saw turned out to be 2 of the 4 hijackers on the plane. The actions he took were clearly wrong. But Ted Kaczynski might be worth a mention here. His ramblings have some solid basis for concern about where society is headed. I wonder if he were 40 years older if he'd just have a podcast instead of a bomb mailing program. Rose McGowan, she was talking crazy shit about people following her and ex-Mossad agents being involved. She was dismissed as insane. Turns out, Weinstein had an army of spies. He had following victims to keep them quiet, including the exact people she had described. The Dixie Chicks, now just the Chicks, spoke out against Bush and the blatant or grab in the Middle East. They were lambasted and removed from media seemingly overnight. When the truth finally came out, they performed not ready to make nice, and it was awesome. The many British postal workers fired and prosecuted for stealing. Many were lifelong employees. Some committed suicide. This went on for almost 2 decades. Spoiler, it was a surveillance software glitch that went ignored for years. They were all innocent. Sinead O'Connor, she was speaking up against the church before anyone really realized how big of an issue the abuse was, and she was crucified for it. 20 years later, and suddenly everyone's biting their tongues and wishing they'd done more sooner. Everyone who said GWB was lying about weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq, they must have felt so vindicated when it came out that he had in fact lied, because there was a lot of backlash against anyone speaking out at the time. Writer Ernest Hemingway was convinced the FBI had him under surveillance. His friends and family told him he was nutters, until some unsealed records a while back proved that he actually was being followed, had his phones bugged, etc. I can't remember his name, but during a huge cholera outbreak, he proposed the theory that it came from the water based on where the cases were. He wasn't believed until a long time later when it was proven to be the water. Glenda Cleveland, she tried to stop Jeffrey Dahmer and instead, the police believed him over her. To this day, I believe that it was because she and Dahmer's victim, Conner X and the Somphone, were POC and Dahmer was white. Sinead O'Connor called out the Catholic Church for child abuse long before it became hip to do so. She was ostracized for it and it ruined her career. Though, Sinead argued that it in fact righted her career trajectory. Ignaz Semmelweis in 1846. Semmelweis proposed the idea that hand washing could prevent the spread of disease in hospitals. He was ridiculed during his time, sent to a mental asylum, and died forgotten by his peers. Monica Lewinsky. The Clintons ruined her life. My immediate thought when the whole meta movement started was of her. Fortunately, she seems to have pulled the okay. Thank goodness she kept that dress. Leave Britney alone, girl. Formerly Guy. Edit. Someone told me this was a girl. I certainly didn't mean to misgender. But someone else said Guy, so whatever he she desires to be called. They were right. Ken Seko was one of the first players to openly discuss how prevalent steroid use was in the 90s. 2000s and people dismissed his claims as being from a player on decline, just trying to stay relevant. A dingo ate my baby lady became a global joke and lots of people ridiculed her. Australian government decided she was lying and responsible, so jailed her 4 years. Turned out a dingo ate her baby.